almost 120 years to change the land acquisition laws that allow government to acquire privately owned land. The fact that a colonial law instituted by the British in 1894 took a century and more to change shows how treacherous this matter is. Taking away land from a farmer destroys his source of livelihood forever. And that's precisely why getting his consent and rehabilitating him was the primary concern when new laws came into effect in January 2014. But there's now a harsh reality or realization that the 2013 Land Act is simply too stringent and has halted development on many fronts. Just this big fact, since January this year, not a single tract of land has been acquired, and projects worth several trillion rupees are stuck across the country because of land. No wonder the present government, in a hurry to get the economy moving, has declared its intention to amend these stringent laws. Social activists are crying foul, and industry is simply waiting and hoping for the changes to come about. Who's right, who's not? Is there a better middle path to land acquisition? Joining me today to answer that question, Dr. DidarSingh, Secretary General FICCI. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Also with me here in the studio, Muhammad Ali Khan, former officer on special duty, OSD, Ministry of Rural Development, who was a key part of formulating the Act today as it is, and also is currently practicing law in the field of land acquisition. We also have with us Brijesh Kalappa, National Speaker, All India Congress Committee, Nisha Singh, Councillor, Municipal Corporation, Gurgaon, and we've also recorded the views of NC Saxena, former member, National Advisory Council. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me here. I think Mr. Arun Jaitley on Sunday has already said that the government will amend the stringent land acquisition law even without the support of the opposition. Now, that's a very, very big statement coming from the Finance Minister. Dr. DidarSingh, what's your first reaction? Is it one of relief saying, yes, finally somebody's realized and it has to be changed?
Let me tell you first of all that when we speak as FICCI or I speak as Secretary General, we speak on what we felt as industry felt was going to be the reaction when you brought in this land law. This is exactly what we predicted, that if you put this kind of law in, you will see all development come to a halt, and the nation is only watching that. And the second thing that we had said, that this will really create a problem in the state governments, and you now see a large number of state governments who are saying that they're not able to go ahead in their own developmental activities because the entire matter has come to a grinding halt. So yes, we believe that a consensus is now emerging, both in state governments as well as in the central government, where a relook on the Land Acquisition Act has to be done. We are not saying that the land acquisition should not look at compensation. Of course, farmers and those people from whom land is acquired must be compensated adequately. We've only been talking about the fact of the delays, the tremendous amount of time frame in which this whole thing was to be done. And secondly, we've been saying that for private purchase, please, this is not purchase being done by government. Please do not interfere with it and let private purchase happen between two individuals, as is a right in our constitution and in our country.
All right. So FICCI, of course, has always, or the industry body has always had its concerns around the new act. Another gentleman who had big concerns is, of course, NC Saxena. Mr. Saxena, you had pronounced the new Land Acquisition Act as both anti-farmer and as anti-industry. So are you feeling validated, I won't say vindicated, but validated that the government is compelled to actually take a relook at the new laws?
Yes, I am sure. I think it's a very good decision because the present law will take so much time to get land that it neither benefits farmers nor it benefits industry. It only benefits the civil society who would be roaming here and there are too many committees which have been set up: Monitoring Committee, Social Assessment Committee, R&R Committee, Chief Secretary's Committee. So therefore, if land cannot be acquired in time, it doesn't benefit the farmers because they will not get compensation in time, and they will also be waiting all the time, cannot invest in that land, and they become losers.
Okay, fair enough. So let's just go over what are the kind of amendments which would come about. First of all, the biggest one which the earlier land law did not have was to get a consent from the farmers or from the landowner. The government could just go and acquire the land, decide on a compensation. There was no consent required. Now, for public-private participation, you need the consent of 70% of landowners if any parcel of land has to be acquired. This, the government says, should be diluted, or at least the industry is saying the government hasn't yet come about and said it, but we are hearing that this could happen. Brijesh Kalapa, this is a act which was, or this law became an act only with not just the Congress but BJP also voting for it. So diluting the consent clause, which was the biggest demand of the landowners and the farmers, is that valid?
You see, Manisha, I think it's fairly clear now that over a period of time, the BJP has shown its true intent, which is to support industry and support industry in not in a fashion in which industry is helped, in a legal fashion, in the sense that they are taken into confidence, and some ameliorative measures are taken to help industry. But instances where industry is kept over and above everybody else, and that includes the Aam Aadmi. And the Indian National Congress stands for the Aam Aadmi, as you well know. When this act actually came through, you must take a step back and look at what happened in the Supreme Court. And in the Greater Noida acquisition case, there were large tracts of land which were taken over and kept for years and years, and no fair compensation was paid. And then that the beneficial use was not established in a clear, transparent fashion. And people were only taking away somebody's source of livelihood and were keeping it for years and years, waiting for the land rates to rise, and then to make windfall gains out of those lands. So it was with this point of view that the entire Land Acquisition Act, which is today fashioned, was actually conceptualized. So the point is that the deal has to be fair to everybody concerned.
Okay.
Right? That industry has to benefit, that likewise the landowner has to benefit, and everybody else who is using the land has to benefit. So this was a holistic...
Kalapa, the very big fact that since January 1st, when this act became a law, not a single parcel of land has been acquired for any development work. Does that not speak of the fact that probably it's too stringent and it needs to be diluted a little bit? Would you agree with that at least?
You see, Manisha, why land acquisitions haven't taken place over the last 6 months or so, I cannot really fathom the reason. But I can very well tell you that in the past, land acquisitions have taken place for far beyond the necessary needs. Right? So I don't know if there's some land bank which is still existent, right, which is going to serve the purpose of the government or the PPPs, right? But for whatever reason that is. And that really has to, it's not merely sufficient to say that land acquisitions haven't taken place. Why they haven't taken place? For what reason? Is the new Land Act coming in the way? This must be analyzed and must be scientifically proven. Before that, one can't just think of doing away with an entire, act which has been otherwise beautifully conceptualized.
Okay, the act is not going to be done with. It's going to get diluted. So I come back. Mohammad Ali Khan, you were part of that act when it happened at every stage. Tell us, what is your view? Was there, in that goal of achieving social equity and ensuring that nobody who loses their land ever is at the receiving end, the act become too stringent and it's dropped or stopped development on its track?
I'll come to that, Manisha, but before that I want to address two things. One, that Mr. Saxena, who's like a mentor to us and who was very important to us through the very beginning of the process, raised, and the other thing that Brijesh said as well. The first issue is, Naresh sir said that there's absolutely no one who benefits from this act. With all due respect, that's not true. Since January, hundreds of thousands of people have had their land released under Section 24(2) of this Act. Section 24(2) was a retrospective clause which basically said that if you are the victim of a long-standing acquisition and your land, either the possession has not been taken or compensation has not been paid to you, then your land stands returned to you. Hundreds of thousands of people have availed the benefit of this clause. 6 judgments of the Supreme Court, many more from the High Court, and even today morning itself, in various forums, land was released. So it is incorrect to say the land hasn't benefited anyone. If the measure of a law is that you determine how many people have benefited by it, then I think the law has been a major success by that yardstick. Second, when you said why has no acquisition taken place, I can answer that to some extent. Remember that the law came into force on the 1st of January 2014. Now thereafter, we were suddenly faced with the prospect of elections, and then the Model Code of Conduct came into operation. That took us till essentially June, when the government was sworn in and took charge. Thereafter, the government, and this is my personal inference, signaled their intent to make the law easier. This was something that the bureaucrats had long been waiting for, because if there was anyone who was not a fan of this law, it's the bureaucrats who had to implement it. If you ask the people who are on the ground, the farmers, etc., and the people who avail the benefit of this act, you'll get a very different picture. But if you speak to the bureaucrats, they'll say, of course, it makes life difficult. Yes, it does. But the law wasn't made for you. It was made for the person whose land is being taken away.
All right.
So my question is, show me examples of where social impact assessments have been initiated and they haven't been completed because of an inherent fault in the process itself. If you can show me that, then I will believe that the process is flawed. But until then, it's purely speculative.
All right. So you talked about Mr. Saxena. So let's hear his views. He actually is saying that let's begin with the first bit that we are hearing, diluting the consent clause. Right now, 70% for PPP projects. If that's diluted, is that going to be harmful to the farmers, or do you think that should be done? That's his response.
No, I think consent clause should be retained, because for public projects which are to be done by government, already the consent clause is not there. That is, if land is required for schools, hospitals, defense purposes, then no consent is taken. But if it is for a profitable project, where quality of where the value of land is going to increase several times, it is very important that the farmers also benefit, and therefore the compensation should be decided in consultation with farmers. You can reduce the number to 50%, that I don't mind, but to do away with consent altogether will mean that we are back to the original law, which means land can be acquired without the consent. It amounts to coercion.
Okay.
So that is not a good decision.
Mohammad Ali Khan, do you agree? 50%, at least we can dilute to that without actually it becoming adversary to the farmers who will be losing land, and also giving some leverage to industry to acquire land very quickly to move ahead?
Well, I agree with what Brajesh sir said earlier. I mean, this was a bill that was passed with the consensus of all parties present. 70% and 80% were numbers that were agreed upon by consensus.
So you're saying no dilution, there shouldn't be. Nisha Singh, come in here. What do you think? I mean, are you in favor of at least the act and the laws being relooked at? And then, of course, the biggest thing, consent clause can get diluted a little bit?
Yes, I'm definitely in the favor of this new law, because as we know, we had a very unfair situation on the ground where a 100-year law was being enacted, and there were profits which were being accrued by a very small set of people, and so the people whose land was being taken away were of course losing out, but regular residents who were living in these lands or using this land were also losing out. So it took us 100 years to change this law, and we now have something which is trying to bring that balance, which is trying to get that unfairness out of the system. And within 9 months we are saying that, well, it's not good enough. So as somebody just pointed out, where is the assessment? Who has assessed whether the law currently is working or not? So in my view, it's a good, very, very progressive step.
So let me go to Dr. DidarSingh. Dr. DidarSingh, the panelists here are saying who's assessed? It's only been 9 months, out of which we lost 5 months for elections, and therefore really it was a country with no deals and no work happening. Have we given the new Land Act enough time to be proven otherwise?
You can leave it for 2 years and you'll still have no acquisition. But let's step back a little bit. What are we talking about? When we talk of acquisition, there are 3 types of acquisition. Acquisition number 1 is a private acquisition between 2 individuals. Second type of acquisition where land acquisition occurs, that is when government acquires land. That is already provided for in the Act.
Absolutely.
The third type is public-private partnerships. And the public-private partnerships, remember, are also for developmental projects. They are actually government-public projects which are given to the private sector to set up in a boot context or annuity or whatever it is. So that's also a developmental context that they're being taken in. Now, when you look at compensation, compensation is determined, it is certainly influenced and determined by whatever price government is paying. So if there's a higher price being paid by government, obviously it will impact all acquisition in the entire area. So what we from industry have been saying, certainly if compensation is to be paid at a certain level, certainly government should go ahead and pay it. And if public-private partnership PPP projects have to pay it, they will pay it. What we have been saying is that leave the private sector acquisitions out of it.
All
now
right.
this, and you know, you can have threshold limits that, you know, every project over a certain 100 crores or whatever else you want to do. But those alone should be in it, and the rest
Dr.
should be left
DidarSingh,
out.
let me hear, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying that none of the clauses should apply for private acquisition of land. You're saying 80% consent is not required, social impact assessment is not required, and the threshold has to be 100 acres of land?
Yes.
All right. Okay, that's a big demand from the industry. Brijesh
Threshold. You
Kalapa,
can decide or threshold, but we are saying that don't, yeah.
all right. So, don't have any consent limits, don't have any social impact assessment. Brijesh Kalapa, come in here. If it's a transaction between two private parties, it's not that the farmers have not been smartened. At least in large parts of the country, they do know their rights. Do you think that if it's a transaction between two private parties, none of these laws should apply? They should only apply in public-private participation, PPP model?
No, if I'm not mistaken, I think the present law is that there is no impediment if it's a private.
Yes, you're absolutely
It's a private acquisition. If my reading of the law is correct,
100% correct.
there is no impediment at all in so far
R&R
as private
compulsory.
acquisition.
State threshold.
All right, so
State-
R&R. All right, so the provision, Dr. DidarSingh, what you're indicating is the R&R provision, which you're saying that, all right, you
If
come in here.
I may, sir, that's conditional. In fact, as Brijesh sir rightly pointed out, no, there is no SIA required at all for private purchase. Private purchase is protected by the doctrine of privity of contract. If you wish to buy land, purchase land, not acquire, then you're free to do so. The only attachment, the only caveat to that is that states will set a particular floor after the purchase of which you will have to satisfy the R&R requirements. States can set that at 1,000 acres, they can set that at 10,000 acres. In fact, to my knowledge, only two states, Karnataka and I think Punjab, have set the floor right now. So that's entirely up to the states, but there's no requirement of SIA, there's no requirement of consent. Once you've agreed, it's fine. R&R only kicks in once the state decides. There's nothing to do with the central government
The
or
state
this
has
law.
to decide. That's
Correct.
also a provision. The state cannot do away with the R&R clause, isn't it? And there is some stringency there that the land will not be handed over or till the R&R provisions are all completely met. Isn't that a little stringent then?
No, that clause particularly applies only in the case where you have to see there are 4 schedules to the law, right? So what happens is first you carry out your SIA. Immediately after the SIA, the report goes to an expert group. The expert group evaluates it, etc., and gives their findings. Once they give you the green light that yes, go ahead, and these are very, very rigorous processes. They're not something that is bound by discretion. In fact, there's no discretion under the law, right? So once these people have arrived at that conclusion, only then does the acquisition process start. This is all pre-acquisition. Once the acquisition process itself starts, there in that case, you cannot forcibly take away someone's land unless you've paid him the compensation or unless you have fulfilled the R&R requirements. But that's in the case of acquisition where there's an element of force. In the case of private purchase, there's no element of force. You and I are buying land from each other, so there's no question of it being contingent on me first satisfying the R&R requirements. It just says once you cross a particular threshold, it will be 10,000 acres. Then you satisfy the R&R requirements, and that basically means you take care of the people who've been displaced. That's it.
All right, let's hear Mr. सक्सेना's views on both. Let's start with the limit the social impact assessment only to certain large projects. I mean, the project size can be defined, but his views on limiting or diluting the current law and act to limiting social impact to large projects.
Yes, that's a good decision because up to 100 hectares, I think the district magistrate or collector should be empowered to take a decision. He should call a meeting of the farmers and the requiring body, settle on a certain figure and acquire land. What is the point of wasting time in social assessment when land is required for, say, a linear project or just 1 or 2 hectares of land where no displacement is going to take place? And therefore, we need to really confine social assessment to large projects.
All right, so he's saying that limit it only to large projects, but then, you know, there's not just a lot of lots of views against diluting the Land Acquisition Act here in the studio. Even social activists are up in arms. They say that the government cannot decide to build cities by destroying villages and snatching away people's livelihoods. So we'll come back, we'll keep discussing on this issue. This winter session of Parliament, what can the government do? Will the changes be enough to balance out the need for social equity with growth when it comes to land acquisition? Welcome back. The Land Acquisition Act 2013 came into being after more than a century. It took years of consultation, debate, discussion, protests for its blueprint to be finalized. And surprisingly, the bill became a law after being debated by the 2 parliamentary standing committees headed by senior BJP leader Shri DidarSingh, that was in 2007, and Sumitra Mahajan in 2009. Therefore, the big question, why does BJP now feel the need to bring about changes in this law? Britesh Kalapa, you know, violent clashes, farmers protesting, just everybody came on board and said the land laws have to change. So now, why another change?
You see, Manisha, I think we have to keep in mind that there is this need to inverse the prism, right? And that is to have about 60% of our population stays in the villages. And our country can't progress if unless there, this large 60% group comes and joins the tertiary sector and increases the number of people in the tertiary sector and less people stay in the primary sector. But that change can't happen overnight, right? That change has to happen over a period of time. It is to happen in a step-by-step gradual process where people have to be handheld and taken towards development. And this is the entire focus of the Indian National Congress, that any progress has to take into account the human element and the human face of the person involved. Now, keeping this in mind was, the entire effort of bringing about this new act, and you see it marks a great giant step in terms of how farmers are treated, because farmers were otherwise not consulted earlier. They were not, they didn't have any say in the matter at all. And this step is an entirely historic one. Of course, the Supreme Court gave us some inputs, and owing to this entire act came through.
Okay, Mohammad Ali Khan, what do you think? Are you surprised? I asked this question again, but just the turnaround for a party which voted for this act has now decided that it's too stringent. I mean, the finance minister has said this Sunday is very stringent and it will be changed with or without the opposition support.
I'll only say this. It was never a question of making acquisition easier. That was never the objective of the law. That was never the idea when the legislative process was going on. The idea was always to make acquisition harder, but at the same time more humane. So the object of the law, Mr. Jaitley sir is very absolutely right when he says that yes, it does put in place more processes, but those processes are there for a reason. And frankly, when the bill was being debated on the floor of Parliament, it did have the support of the BJP, and the BJP put forth 2 amendments which were indeed accepted. One related to the inclusion of lease, which was inserted, and the other related to a share of the original owner if the property was subsequently acquired. So both these amendments were put in place, and I fail to see now why these concerns are being raised now rather than back then when the law was being debated.
All right. Nisha Singh, is it possible, would you give this government a little room to, probably say, all right, we did debate, we did discuss, but now when it's implemented and when it's being acted upon, things are looking very difficult. After all, there are 100 cities to be built. Starting with Dhulera in the Prime Minister's own state, where land acquisition is becoming an absolute impossible task to, do?
Manisha, I think I'll come to the point of 100 cities that are to be developed and discuss that first. Currently, what the model that we are employing to develop our urban cities is the sprawl model. The sprawl model is that we spread out our cities over so many hundreds of kilometers that even to build infrastructure in this city is costing the city governments and the governments a lot of money. For residents to live in a city like this is costing them a lot of money as well, because there's huge commute that they have to do. There are other costs like keeping your maintaining your surroundings. So instead of having a model where we keep acquiring land and keep spreading out, and the way Gurgaon develops is a classic example of urban sprawl, where we go and acquire 20 kilometers outside Gurgaon, whereas there are so many pockets of land within Gurgaon and actually in all our cities which are either underutilized at this point or are not rightly utilized. So instead of redeveloping what we already have, making most of what we already have, making more from less is the need of a country like India, which is one, short on land, and two, we are so highly populated that we have to look at making smarter use of the land that we have. If you make land acquisition cheap, if you make it easy for a certain set of people, what are they going to do? They're going to acquire it and they're going to waste it. Something that can be, if an industry can be built in 100 acres, if land is going to be just 3% of that cost, you're going to buy 200 acres for that. And then you're going to sit on a huge land bank, which is going to be underutilized. And as I said, a very small section of the people are going to benefit from the rise of that land. So,
to a large extent, I must say that there are enough viewpoints and enough examples, including in China, which has ghost cities, to support that argument,
exactly.
Nisha Singh.
Exactly.
So it's an interesting aspect, British Kalapa, where Nisha is saying that if you make land acquisition easy and cheap, then you will waste land. And for a country of 1.2 billion people and a large number dependent on agriculture, that should not just be the route to take for any government.
No, I agree wholly. I agree totally on this. And we have had several corporations which have, because I hail from Karnataka, and since land was available, they picked up huge, vast tracts of land. They're using less than 5 to 10% of that land, and they're sitting on these huge land banks and only waiting for the land rates to rise. And at some point in time, a very small section of the society is going to make windfall gains on this land. And this is something which is wholly unacceptable to the country at large, because you must take into account that everybody speaks of two Indias, and how long are we going to perpetuate this this climate of having two Indias? We must bring everybody on board. Everybody has to have a share of the resources of the country, and this I think is most essential given the present scenario. And but I must tell you that insofar as the BJP is concerned and their attitude over the last 3-4 months of their rule has been that forget about the poor man, forget about everybody else. I mean, only a big capitalist must suffer, must live and must thrive. And there is this news report which is extremely appalling, that 9 banks refused to give a huge loan to one entity who is very close to the Prime Minister of India, and that entity is now going to be funded by the SBI, which is a national bank. So this is, this kind of approach is something which is deeply painful to all of us.
All right. Interestingly, when I spoke to Mr. Saxena, he had another point of view. Yes, livelihoods will go, but he also has another formula which he says will work when it comes to land acquisition, and why it should not be made absolutely impossible and difficult for industry to acquire land. Hear him out.
No, on the contrary, I'm always in favor of increasing compensation. Let's not forget. Take for instance the question of a power plant. A 4,000 megawatt power plant would require about 250 hectares of land. So it may displace about 250 farmers, and its cost will be 25,000 crores. even if you pay 1% of the project cost to the farmers directly, each farmer becomes a crorepati. So they will get 1 crore each. So therefore, there is every case of increasing the direct costs, the direct money which goes on to the farmers, and the indirect money which is because of delays and uncertainty, and which goes to politicians, that needs to be reduced. So I am in favor of higher compensation to farmers, but the time limit should be reduced. There should be certainty of getting possession as early as possible, so that the value of land starts increasing and farmers also benefit, because for 20 years they will keep on getting some part of that benefit.
Mohammad Ali Khan, we do need growth, isn't it? And I think Mr. Saxena also said that we may displace farmers when we create a power plant, but then if you compensate them adequately, then the farmers also benefit from the growth. Not only that, you need to create jobs. We have a demographic dividend that we are talking about, which could actually become a curse if those people do not have a job. Even people or youth in the villages now aspires to have good productive jobs. So how do you meet those two? I know everybody is saying don't change the Land Acquisition Act, but in the current form it is making acquisition of land very difficult.
Well, Jairam Rameshji, who was, I like to call him the father of this law, would always say that, look, India is a land deficit and a people surplus country, and that's a reality, and you have to balance those two elements out. So, and the other thing he would always say is that there has to be a middle path. You have to find a balance. And in doing so, he would point to...
So you're saying the current act is a middle path?
Yes.
Are you saying
yes,
that?
Absolutely.
That there's no dilution needed?
Absolutely. We stand by what we drafted. But the thing that I'm saying is, a very clear illustration can be found in the case of the Cochin airport, and IIM Ahmedabad has actually done a study on this, which we used in our while we were drafting this. In the case of the Cochin airport, instead of acquiring the land, the government acted as an arbitrator or a mediator. It sat the landowners down on one side and the developer down on one side and said, look, what do you guys think is a fair arrangement? And they arrived at their own terms. That is what the government should do. That is what the role of the government should be limited to. I think Rohini ma'am pointed out something very correctly. Use your existing land banks. Just yesterday, the DDA published a survey whereby it was found out that the existing size of their land bank in Delhi is equal to the size of the entire Lutean zone. So what is that land being utilized for? Why do we have this constant desire to acquire more and more?
Okay, all right. Well, we know that closed door talks are on. Government does need the support of the other parties, if not in Lok Sabha where it has a majority, but definitely in the Rajya Sabha. So what will really happen? We'll come back and take a quick look at that. What can get diluted? Practically, I know everybody is against it, at least here in the studio with me. The one person who supported is of course, industry representative Dr. Singh. He says that we do need a dilution. We come back and discuss it a little bit more before we wrap out on how do we achieve social equity with growth with the present land acquisition laws. The finance minister has declared his intentions and his government's intention to bring about changes in the Land Act 2013. Some of the contentious clauses are consent clause. For private projects, at least 80% of farmers must consent to surrender their land, 70% in the case of PPP projects. There's also the social impact assessment clause. An independent expert group has to review the socio-economic outcome of the proposed development plans before giving the green signal. Then there is a land bank clause. If land acquired is not used for the stated purpose within 5 years, it must be returned to the original owner or to the state land bank. Project affected clause. Landless laborers, artisans and all those whose livelihoods are put at risk by the proposed project are to be compensated, not just the land owners. And then of course the R&R clause. Rehabilitation and resettlement must be undertaken for all the projects affected, even if 80% of the landholders voluntarily sell their land, and land will not be handed over till R&R is complete. There's also a food security clause that multi-crop land cannot be acquired for any project, whether it's public or private, unless it's the last resort. Resale clause. If acquired land is sold to a third party, the original owners get a 40% of the sale amount. And then there's a retrospective effect. The Act applies with retrospective effect where no land acquisition award has been made, along with cases where the land was acquired 5 years ago but no compensation has been paid or no possession has taken place. And we did, of course, Mr. Khan here cited some examples of how that has already benefited number of farmers across the country. Now, what are the possible amendments which could be brought about by the government? The consent clause could be diluted. It could completely be done away with for PPP projects, as ownership of land rests with the government. So that's a very big one. Limit social impact assessment only to certain large projects, and that large could be defined. We still have to wait and see how that would pan out, what that large could be, whether it's 100 acres or it's more or less. Possession of land will not be contingent on R&R. Retrospective clause provisions could be amended. That's another one, very important one, which the industry is not happy about. And compensation clause, of course, the government has ruled out any changes to this one. So those are some of the big changes you can expect from the government. Last word, Mr. Kalapa, from you on some of the changes which could come about. None of them acceptable to you or the Congress party, absolutely?
Like you rightly said, Manisha, it's taken 100 years to reach here. And I remember a joke which somebody told me that, he was invited in peak winter to his friend's house next door. And then he realized that every step he took, he slipped, back 2 steps. And then he goes and tells his friend that, look, this is what was happening. So his friend says, if you were slipping 2 steps back, then how did you reach in the first place? He says, no, I turned back and I was going home. That's the reason I reached here. So it's like that. If you, the point is, if you take, this has taken a really long time to reach where we are. And if we are now thinking of going back, right, this is wholly counterproductive. The clock can't be really turned back. And there is too much at stake because we are sitting on growth, and we are sitting on denying people their due rights. So this is something I think the government must take a step after consulting everybody, and without thinking that only industry is foremost for them. This is not Gujarat where this kind of thing will work. People are very touchy about their land rights, and they are extremely they're going to be very sensitive on this.
All right, very sensitive issue, but the government, well, if it has a joint session of the parliament with the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha combined, could actually pass it or clear it. All that we can say is the very name of the new Land Acquisition Act, the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, rehabilitation and resettlement, indicates its purpose and aim to ensure that those displaced by purchase of their land are resettled and rehabilitated, and in addition compensated fairly. So we can only hope that is achieved. Gentlemen and DidarSingh, thank you very much for joining me today on this discussion.